Arigato e konbanwa mina. Hello and welcome to the MGRO Music Show. Now, 2020, stuck in lockdown, it's given me more time than ever to listen to music, so I decided to set myself a challenge. I would get into the music of a country outside of the English language, and as you can probably tell from the title of this video, that was Japan. And it's been a hugely fascinating and interesting experience. But I can understand how daunting it is trying to get into the music of an entirely different country. You know, you've got like 50 years of context and multiple scenes. It's like saying, oh, I'm going to get into British music. Like, oh, that's brilliant. Do you mean to start with Aphex Twin or Little Mix? So I'm making this video for people who are looking to take a similar journey like myself into the music of Japan, using what I've learned over the year to try and help people who are trying to get into it to find a good place to start, or where to look into, or which areas might interest them. And I find the best way to get into the music of another country is to look at all the different subgenres and scenes that have emerged there over the years. And I find that the best way to do that with Japan is to give a brief overview of the history of the music of the country, and then highlighting where each of the core subgenres that are associated with Japanese music popped up at different points in time. Now, Japanese music as we know it emerged during the 1950s in the form of Kyokyokyu. I apologise for any mispronunciations there, but that's generally considered the beginning of J-pop, where Western styles like blues and jazz were given lyrics in the Japanese language in the traditional pentatonic scale. But in the 1960s, you get an extra dose of Western influences coming into Japanese music. They have the introduction of electric guitars, rockabilly, and of course, because it was the 1960s, Beatlemania, which leads to the formation of a Japanese rock scene, but not without some controversy, where there was the debate over whether the Japanese language could actually fit with rock melodies, which the answer, it does, which was confirmed with what is generally considered the first classic of Japanese rock, the 1970 album by the band Happy End, which signifies the first major subgenre of Japanese music, Folk. Folk was a popular form of Japanese folk music, heavily inspired by Western folk artists of the time like Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan. So the best way to describe it is it sounds very of the early 70s, like the sort of music you'd hear in the film Almost Famous. And this produced a brand new, unique form of Japanese music, which began to be known as new music, leading to hugely popular successes such as Takuro Yoshida, Yosui Inui, and more darker alternative folk artists like Morita Doji. Which brings us on to the other majorly popular Japanese subgenre at this point, enka. Again, another heavily folk-influenced type of music, but drawing more on traditional Japanese styles like Kyokyokyu and Ryukoka, which is again sung in the traditional Japanese pentatonic scale, with taking the form of slow ballads with lyrics relating to love, loss, all the soap opera stuff, often making up a lot of the best-selling Japanese singles and albums of this period from artists like Shiro Meya and Shinichi Mori. The popularity of enka and foku led to a greater emphasis and focus being put on solo female singer-songwriters, who towards the latter end of the 1970s, artists like Yumi Arai and Toyoko Onuki started taking more and more influence from styles from the West. With the introduction of the synthesizer at the turn of the 80s, all this came together to lead to the rise and creation of one of the most popular Japanese subgenres, city pop, which has started to gain a online cult following in recent years, both in and of itself and also through its sampling in the electronic subgenre of future funk. Now, I'd say the best way to understand city pop is like a Japanese version of Western sophistopop artists like Sade and Simply Red. It's very new wave, mixing together synth pop, R&B, funk, disco, pop, all fusing them all together in this really chilled late night creation. And this is one of the types of Japanese pop music I hugely got into and absolutely love. A lot of major artists, including Maria Takeuchi, who's produced the infamous Plastic Love, but also ones like Junko Yagami, Anri, Momoko Kikuchi, and another majorly successful artist from this period being Tatsuro Yamashita, which perfectly matched the Japan of the 80s with its heavily business-based, late-night city life, and of course the invention of car stereos. The 80s also signalled a major breakthrough for hugely popular Japanese rock with groups such as Southern All-Stars, but more importantly, leading to the breakthrough of probably the most significant genre in Japanese rock music, visual K, heavily inspired by glam rock and hair metal, with a strong influence being placed upon power ballads, and most importantly, as you expect from the visual part of the title, the visual image, the makeup, the hairdo, leading to absolutely huge, gigantic artists of Japanese rock music, such as X Japan and Bucktick. In fact, Visual K even had a resurgence in the mid-2010s via artists like The Gazette and Sid. So, with the success of city pop, you started to see a greater emphasis being put on Japan as a pop powerhouse, leading to the greater emphasis on individual pop idols inspired by the solo singer-songwriter female artists of city pop. But towards the latter end of the 1980s, this started to take the form of not just individual pop idols, but pop idol groups, with the first major male pop idol group being Hikaru Genji, and the first major female pop idol group being, Onyanko Club. As we go into the 1990s, pop idols proved the main form of popular music in Japan, one particular example of this being the male groups created by the talent agency Johnny and Associates, creating male-led idol groups who have a sort of more of a pop rock fusion in their style, such as BZ, SMAP, and Kinkai Kids, and leading to a whole host of similar artists taking up the airways in 90s Japan, such as Mr. Children, Glay, and V6. Whereas towards the latter end of the 90s and the turn of the millennium, we start to see the re-emergence of the female solo pop idol, but now with a more R&B influence in their style, leading to huge successes such as Hikaru Utada, Ayumi Hamasaki, and Nami Amuro. But it's not all pop idols. Of course, with it being the 90s, you also have the huge success of alternative rock, with some artists like these being huge chart successes like L'Arc-en-Ciel and Lunacy, and the continued success of some visual K artists. You also have some that are more punkish and indie in nature, like Shonen Knife and Number Girl. But you also have those that are far more experimental and chaotic in nature, like The Boredoms and Melt Banana. And speaking of experimental, now seems as good a time as any to mention Japan's place in electronic music. Japan played a hugely important role in the rise of synthesizers in the late 70s via the group The Yellow Magic Orchestra. And throughout the 80s, Japan started to become known for its underground noise music scene. On the one end of noise music, you have the very laid-back, ambient new age end, which included artists like Hiroshi Yoshimura and Yasuaki Shimizu. Whereas on the other hand, you have the very harsh, abrasive, avant-garde, challenging noise, which has actually become known as its own subgenre, Japan noise, which came to greater attention during the 90s with the emergence of its most well-known artist, Merzbow. You also started to see Japanese artists emerge for each of the major subgenres of electronica during the 90s, with DJ Crush in trip-hop and Kenny Shi in techno. But speaking of trip-hop, easily the most major indie subgenre from 1990s Japan has to be Shibuya Kei, which is a really unique crossover. It was a mixture of 90s trip-hop with 60s bossa nova and lounge pop, leading to it's one of my absolute favourite subgenres from Japanese music, including tons of fantastic releases from artists like Toate, Cornelius, Chiba Mato, Pizzicato 5, and Puffy Amiyumi. As we go into the 2000s, we see the continued success and emergence of indie and alternative rock artists such as The Pillows and Kuruli, but generally, pop idols still absolutely dominate the scene, with a lot of the major ones of the 90s continuing to have huge major takeover success throughout the 2000s, along with the emergence of new ones such as Exile and Muse. But as we get into the early 2010s, the focus shifts further away from pop idol solo artists to pop idol groups who become immensely bigger, not just in terms of sales, but in terms of the literal groups themselves. Some get up to like 30, 40, ever-increasing size of members, and they just become a huge powerhouse in of themselves as an industry with just constant success. If you look at the Japanese charts from throughout the 2010s, pop idols just absolutely dominate, with artists including AKB48, SKE48, Passcode, Boys and Men, Six Tones, Heisei Jump, Arashi, Johnny's West, with some groups even splitting off into different smaller groups for each different region and county of Japan. But alongside this, you also get pop groups and artists that take a more Shibuya-kei and electropop approach in their work, such as Kei Pamyu, who became a viral success around 2009 with Pon Pon Pon, and the hugely acclaimed pop act Perfume. So, where are things now in the present day? Well, if you look at the most recent Oricon charts, pop idols still absolutely dominate the charts, but now with the rise of Korean artists also having huge success in the Japanese Oricon charts. It started around the early 2000s with artists like Boa and Toho Shinki, but in more recent years has had Korean artists being absolutely huge in Japan and having huge chart-topping successes. I'm talking about artists like Twice and Stray Kids. But alongside this, you also have the success of, the typical artists that have that great pop-rock combo, such as Bish, Bump of Chicken, Aimyon, and Yoasobi, alongside solo pop successes like Kenshi Yonezu and Daoko.